Working over the last, good grief, 5 or 6 years on a part of Indiana history that so many people are totally unaware of. And that is the fact that the first non-English speaking ethnic group that moved into this area in large numbers were Swedes. A lot of people are very familiar with the Swedish aspects of the Kjellberg farm, but have no idea that the Kjellbergs were part of a very large group of people who emigrated into this area. There were so many Swedes who spoke Swedish, lived in Sweden for a lot of their lives before they came here, that the Chesterton Tribune had articles on the front page written in Swedish because so many of their readers didn't read English. And the first church established in Porter was Swedish Lutheran. It wasn't even Porter at the time. The first church in Miller was Swedish Lutheran. The first church in Hobart was Swedish Lutheran. The first church in Chesterton was St. Patrick's. But the largest was Swedish Lutheran. And there are also Swedish Lutheran churches in Michigan City and in LaPorte. In fact, the first Swedish Lutheran church in Indiana was established in LaPorte. And there were Swedish Lutheran churches, this amazed me when I started working on this, in Whiting and in East Chicago and Indiana Harbor and downtown Gary, where the Swedish language was used in worship for many years. I can understand. My folks went to Spain. They were there for a year and a half helping the Spanish government build a steel mill. Well, when they went to church, they looked for a church with services in English. That makes sense. And it makes sense for all the people who came here, that they want to worship in a language where they'll understand what's going on, and the psalms and the hymns are words that they recognize and they like. What amazed me with the Swedes is that 75 years later, they were still worshiping in Swedish. And when they finally moved to English, it wasn't an easy thing to do. So I'm learning an awful lot. I spent most of the day today on that, and then towards the end of the day got my things on sand mining back together again. I hope to have the book finished and out by this summer. And I don't know if Joan makes the arrangements or if Serena does, but I'd be happy to come back. Now, I started working on that project when my Duneland book was finished, and it was because of the Duneland book that I was intrigued with it, because the Duneland book has something about Lucia Day at the Kjellberg farm and the Midsummer Festival, and that was a seed for me, and I needed to know a little bit more about what happened. I found errors in other books. The Kjellbergs are given credit for founding Augsburg Church. No, Augsburg Church was here when they arrived. It was already started. So I realized really early on you can't believe everything you read. Certainly can't believe everything you see on the internet. And so I was very intrigued with that. And then I got a call from the National Lakeshore asking if I would do a report on sand mining. That their park rangers take people through the woods and over the hills and places, and they really don't know what areas. They know a lot of areas that have been sand mined, but they didn't have a full description of what had been done in the national park and the areas around the national park. And so they hired me to write a report. It's the first time and the only time I've ever been paid for writing. And, but that meant I had to set the Swedish stuff over to one side, and I worked on this. And because it was the people who paid me was the National Park Service, what I gave them was a product of the National Park Service and is free to anybody who wants it. It's not something I can sell. It's available, it's on the web. The whole thing, start to finish, is on the web. If you, I'll have the website at the end of this talk, but all you have to do is Google my name and sand mining, and you'll find it. And so you can download it and print it yourself, and there's no charge. A lot of people think of me as a historian, and I take great pleasure in that, because it's not a bad reputation for a geologist to have. But when I was in high school, I wanted to be a high school science, high school social studies teacher. I wanted to teach history. I had a particularly good history professor in high school, and in later years I became very friendly with Lance Trusty, who was a professor of history at Purdue Calumet. Dr. Trusty just passed away a few months ago, and I was very pleased to have lunch with him not long before he passed away. I've always loved history, and when I became a science teacher, it was actually after I was a teacher that I realized the relationship between science and history, particularly between geology and history. And that's where I've sort of found my niche. I have to say the Swedish side has moved me over to the dark side, away from there's very little geology in that book. It would be mainly history. But the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore asked me to do this talk on this talk. They didn't ask me to talk, they asked me to write on sand mining, because what they needed was something that was both geology and history. And the history of sand mining definitely involves both. This is one of my favorite photographs. It was taken probably in Lake Station, and it gives you an idea how large sand mining operations were in some areas. Great. When I was here last time, I did a quote by this man, and I've just got to start today with the same quotes I did before, because I realized not everybody heard them before. But many of you may have driven through Tipton, Indiana. Some of you know that there's not besides a town named Tipton, there's a county named Tipton, and they're both named after John, who was one of the early pioneers of the state of Indiana. He founded the city, not of Tipton, he founded the city of Columbus. He was very upset when they named it Columbus, because Columbus had nothing to do with it. He did. He helped establish Indianapolis as the capital of the state. They didn't name that after Tipton either. He chaired the Indiana Committee on Roads and Canals, and he helped set the Indiana-Illinois boundary. So I don't know if y'all know that the boundary between Indiana and Illinois, of course, is State Line Avenue through the west side of Lake County and the east side of Cook County. But why was that line there? Well, if you could go as a crow flies along the Indiana state line going due south, you would eventually get to the courthouse in Vincennes. And Vincennes is the boundary north of the Wabash River between Indiana and Illinois. And so surveyors had to march all the way up from Vincennes, crossing the Ohio River, and going up to Lake Michigan to know exactly what was Indiana and what was Illinois. So he got to know Northwest Indiana, even though he spent most of his time in the southern part of Indiana. And this is what he said when he founded the Indiana sand dunes. These ponds, marshes, and sand hills can never admit of settlement, will never be of much service to our state. Period. Think of that next time you drive through Tipton. The Chesterton Tribune. Now, that was a southern Indiana man who wrote that. The Chesterton Tribune wrote, without a bit of exaggeration, the Dune Country is the most God-forsaken place in the state of Indiana. In the midst of sandhills, swamps, and sloughs, its headquarters for malaria, sandburrs, and bullfrogs. And do you see what malaria and bullfrogs equal in that? One of my big surprises when I was working on the sand mining report was that geologists weren't all environmentalists. In fact, they were almost the opposite of environmentalists in the early years. The reason Indiana had a geological survey in the early part of its history was not because they were interested in science, but because they wanted to make money on having companies paying taxes as they extract minerals from the ground. And the more minerals that they can get from the ground, the more money the state can make. So whether it was coal or petroleum or gypsum or limestone or sandstone or sand, geologists helped you find it, and they would publish reports saying this is where it is, come and get it. When I was a major in geology, things had changed, and people were much more concerned about the care of the earth rather than the exploitation of the earth. Well, our two biggest mineral resources are water and sand. Now, sand is definitely a mineral resource. Water, to be a mineral, you have to be a solid. So, well, water is a solid in the wintertime, and that was a valuable commodity. As you can't talk about sand mining without talking about ice harvesting at the same time. In 1914, the Indiana State geologist Edward Barrett wrote, "There is an inexhaustible amount of sand." He's talking about right along the beach. Inexhaustible because the ridge is continually renewed by sand washing up from the lake and then moved by the wind, forming this huge tube. In other words, come and get it. Come get as much sand as you want because there's more coming up every year. Now, the geology part of my talk is why is there sand here? Why do we care? What does this area look like geologically? And this is my favorite geologic map of the area. And one of the things that geologists learned really early on is in the first 10 or 20 miles, the closer you get to Lake Michigan, the younger the landscape is. So the oldest landscape is the Valparaiso Moraine, which is south of Chesterton. And the Valparaiso Moraine forms a big U around the southern end of Lake Michigan, from Michigan through LaPorte County and Porter County and Lake County and Cook County and then up into Wisconsin. Giant U at one time contained Lake Michigan. There's a smaller moraine north of that doesn't go everywhere, and it's called the Tinley Moraine, but it is due south of Chesterton. And a lot of Portage Township is in the Tinley Moraine. If you're familiar with Crown Point, if you know where Beaver Dam Ditch is, if you're south of Beaver Dam Ditch, you're in the Valparaiso Moraine. If you're north of Beaver Dam Ditch, you're in the Tinley Moraine. And for the early geologists, they didn't differentiate. They didn't know one from the other. They called the whole thing Valparaiso Moraine. Then there's the Lake Border Moraine, which formed islands in the middle of Lake Michigan at one time. And this is where the Shelburne Farm is and the Bailey Homestead and things of that sort. It's just north of this is the Little Calumet River as it flows through here. Then the former shorelines of Lake Michigan, I've talked about previously. The Glenwood shoreline was built right north of the moraine. And that's the oldest shoreline. This is the Michigan City area here. The Glenwood shoreline sort of peters out as you move west. But then it becomes very strong again in Lake County, and the Glenwood shoreline can be seen easily in Dyer and Cherville. In fact, if you've ever had dinner at Teeble's Restaurant, how many people have eaten at Teeble's Restaurant? Even though it's in Lake County. Gee, that's awfully big of it. Teeble's Restaurant, I think of it every time I go there as being a lakeside restaurant. Because it's up on the beach. And the beach ran right along where US 30 is today. Why do you think they built a highway right there? Because it was a nice, smooth way to build the road. And if you go north of US 30, you go down into Lake Michigan if you want to go to Walmart or Strachan Van Til's or any of those shops that are down below the shoreline. Now, the younger shoreline, about 12,000 years ago, was the Calumet shoreline, and that's right along Route 12, the Dunes Highway in this area. The prison is on Calumet sand, and this is Route 12. Route 12 then goes into Gary and abandons the Calumet shoreline, but in Lake County, it's Ridge Road. And that's why Ridge Road is not an east-west road. It curves because that's the way the shoreline curved. And then the youngest shoreline is Tolleson. And these are where the biggest sand dunes are. This is where the most money could be made if you were going to mine sand and if you could find customers. And it wasn't hard to find customers. A lot of people are surprised when they visit Dune Acres the first time. They're on Route 12, they can see some sand ridges, and then they go up Mineral Springs Road. There's this wetland. There are no dunes there at all. And what they're doing is going in this area that was lake bottom at one time between the Calumet shoreline and then the Tolleson shoreline. And the Tolleson dunes are where the really tall dunes are, the Ogden Dunes and Dune Acres and Indiana Dune State Park and all have focused on. Now over to the west, and I hate to say it, but you can't find it in Porter County, is an area called Dune and Swale. And it's a very confusing thing to most people, mainly because it's got a confusing name. They never should have called it Dune and Swale. They should have called it Beach Ridge and Swale, because then people would understand what it was. It's about 150 different beach ridges from the high Tolleson shoreline all the way up to Lake Michigan. And each one maybe 7 or 8 feet wide and 5 or 6 feet high. And then you're a sand ridge, and then there's a low wetland and another sand ridge, and another low area and another sand ridge. And this is what the city of Gary and East Chicago and South Chicago and Whiting and Indiana Harbor and North Hammond were all built on. It's a lousy landscape for building a city or a steel mill. It's just terrible. You don't want all these wetlands through, and you get wet walking to your neighbor's house. If your neighbor lives north or south of you, you have to have all your neighbors east or west of you, and then you can stay up on that sand ridge. But it's not called Beach Ridge and Swale, it's called Dune and Swale. Those aren't really sand dunes, they are beach bridges. Most of them were modified by the wind, but they're not like Mount Top. And so it's a bad name, but they didn't ask me when they named it. We're sort of stuck with it. This is where we'll find Chesterton. It's the north of the Tinley Moraine, south of the Lake Border Moraine, and it's basically land that was the bottom of Lake Michigan a long time ago. This area, as you've heard in plenty of lectures before mine, was a wilderness, and pioneers came in here, and Indiana was formed as a state in 1816, and Porter County was formed as a county about 1837, give or take a year, I'm not really sure. That was the pioneer period. People were building log cabins, and some of them were very, very well built, and some of them were so poorly built that they were destroyed as soon as the family could build something else. And so we don't see them anymore. When there's a log cabin left and somebody either discovers it because they're tearing off the aluminum siding of their house and they find a log cabin underneath, they usually find a very good one there, because if it weren't very good, it would have been torn down and taken apart and the logs used for something else. But the pioneer period basically ended in 1850, because in 1850, Michigan City was connected by rail to the east. Chicago wasn't. Michigan City was. You can see Michigan City was very pleased. The train lines were gradually extending from Baltimore and from New York and Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania, other places in Pennsylvania, to the west. But the builders of the Michigan Central Railroad were not interested so much in getting to Michigan City. They were interested in going through Michigan City in order to get to Chicago, because that's where the real customers were. That's where a lot of the heavy traffic, the boat traffic was, because the canal that connected the Lake Michigan waterway with the Mississippi waterway passed through Chicago. So they were interested in getting to Chicago, but they weren't the only railroad. And why you say, why am I talking about railroads when I'm supposed to be talking about sand mining? Because this is where sand mining began. There was a race between the Michigan Central and the Michigan Southern to see who could get to Chicago first. This is one of my favorite postcards. It's a nice colorized postcard showing an old-fashioned train, of course, but behind it is unmistakably the Michigan City Depot. So in 1851, two railroads went through this area, the Michigan Central and the Michigan Southern and Northern Indiana, racing through to see which one could get to Chicago first. They crossed at the town of Porter. The Michigan Southern went through Chesterton and took the northern route through Lake County. The Michigan Central had the northern route in Porter County, and then west of Porter had the southern route. And it was basically a tie. They got there with the same spring. I think the Michigan Southern got there a couple of weeks ahead of the other, but the weeks didn't make any difference. They both found customers. Now, the next year, 1853, a third railroad came through this area. You would think the Monon was going to Chicago, but it wasn't. It was going up to Michigan City. Again, the owners of the railroad thought Michigan City was going to be, the big powerhouse city at the south end of the lake. After all, Chicago's on the wrong side of the lake. It doesn't face the east, and the big city is on the east coast. You have to go around the lake to get to Chicago, but they were wrong. There were three other railroads while we're talking about railroads that came in. The B&O, which is a railroad that everybody who's ever played Monopoly knows all about. And before we get any further, notice that LaPorte County has railroads pretty close to the lake. Lake County has railroads pretty close to the lake. Porter County does not. So the B&O came through this way. It skipped Chesterton completely, but it went through McCool, if you're familiar with where McCool is. And then through Chrisman, and then up to Miller. And one of the iconic pictures of the early days of the town of Miller is this one that shows the Michigan Central, the Michigan Southern, and the B&O crossing right at Lake Street. And that's where that is. Then in 1892, the Wabash Railroad came through. It didn't go very close to the lake at all, but it went through Chrisman and Etna, which I'll talk about in a little bit. All of these railroads played an important role in the removal of sand from northwest Indiana. The last railroad of import was the South Shore, which I did in blue because it was an electric line. And I don't know why blue for electric, but it just sounded good. And I wanted to do something that was different from the others. And notice it was fairly close to the shore in Porter County. And Tremont, of course, became an important stop for people who wanted to go to the dunes. And dunes, all along basically the eastern side of Lake Michigan. Dunes are not found on the west side of Lake Michigan because the wind blows the dry winds blow basically from the west to the east. So in Wisconsin and in Cook County and in those lovely towns called Lake Forest and Wilmette and Winnetka on the east side north of Chicago, the waves of Lake Michigan, just like that geologist, Mr. Barrett said, wash the sand up onto the beach, and the sand dries out in the hot summer sun, and then the wind comes up and blows it right back into Lake Michigan. But on the east side of the lake, the waves wash the sand up. It dries out in the summertime, and those nice, dry summer winds then blow the sand away from the lake and into piles of sand that we call sand dunes. And so there are some very, very high sand dunes on the east side of Lake Michigan. And many of the railroads were built very close. In fact, here you can see, you think that's a railroad line, yes, but this is a railroad line right along the base of the sand dune. Makes it real easy to get to the sand from the tracks. This is my fallback position. I was supposed to bring a book with me. I got it off the bookshelf. It's called Sand in My Shoes by Ruth Nicholson. And it's not in my car, so I don't have it. But I did have the section I was going to read in a slide at the end of the program. And so before we started, I moved it up here so you don't lose anything, but it's more fun to read it from the book. A company had purchased the long high hill just east of the Miller Cemetery, where railroad ties and rails had been laid for quite a distance, all along the eastern side of the hill from the main railroad, the B&O. The local train would come from Chicago with empty gondolas and boxcars. Men were hired to bring wheelbarrows, and planks were furnished for each man. He would select an empty car and start his work, loading the wheelbarrow with sand, then pushing the load on the plank path and dumping the sand into the empty railroad car. Sometimes when needed, they would have to pitch load when close to the car. Later in the afternoon, perhaps the next day, a train from the east would pick up the loaded cars. The men were usually paid $1 per boxcar. And if it were an extra gig car, maybe they'd receive a few more cents, like 10 or 25 cents. Seldom was more than one car loaded by each man. You can be sure it was a hard day's work. When the hill had been leveled down to the level of the railroad track, the job of moving the track closer to the hill was done. I remember hearing the railroad boss give orders so that all men at the same time would lift the track. What a job! When this hill was leveled, when the leveling of the hill was finished, which took years, another hill west of the Miller station was converted into a sand pit. Can you imagine how happy and thankful families were when the father could earn that much money? Sand mining was a tough job at first. Why was the very first sand mining was done in order to make a path for the railroads. So it wasn't done to sell and make money, but it was done because the railroads do not like to climb over hills. They want to make the route as level as they can, so when they get to a sand dune, if it's in their way, they want to move it out. And in the early days, it was done by hand. And they would lay a temporary track like this. Here's a temporary little gondola, and guys with shovels would shovel. Can you imagine that job? And then they would get a horse to pull it out. Now, what do you do with the sand? Well, there are low spots, too, that you want to fill in. So here you've all seen trains that are on what we call high lines, where they built a ridge and the train track is running along the top of the ridge. Well, that sand had to come from someplace. It would come from some sand dune. And then in this case, what they do is, as the hill gets longer, they lay more track. They bring those loaded cars up to the top, to the end of the track, and dump it out. And the sand then falls down, and then it brings another box car or another top roof of sand and dump that down until gradually they get the high level ground that they want to put the railroad on. And here's a photo of Michigan City or the next day in the same place. But eventually, the sand is no longer close enough to the tracks, and then you have to move the track closer to the dune itself. People started buying sand by the ton, and customers did not like it when the sand was wet, because it weighed so much more and they felt they were getting gypped. So the customers basically forced the sand companies into installing drying equipment, which were large conveyors with fires underneath that would heat the sand up and eventually dry it out, so that what they were selling was dry sand, not wet sand. But there was one place where you couldn't escape the water, It costs money to mine sand. A company either has to buy the property and when you buy property, you have mineral rights. So if there's gold underneath your house and you didn't know it when you bought it, that's yours. If there's oil or petroleum or anything else, if it's in your lot, it's yours. And sand companies realized one way to avoid paying the owner or having to buy the land was to take the sand from the bottom of Lake Michigan. So they started, I hate to use the word suck, because one of the things you learn in science class is that science never sucks. Meaning it's always a pressure pushing, not, it's, when you drink a Coke, the pressure isn't caused, you're creating a vacuum with your mouth, and then air pressure pushes the Coke down and comes up. So it's not the sucking process. Nevertheless, these boats, like this one out here, are called sand suckers. That's a photograph. Sandra Layton lives in Seymour, Indiana right now, but she grew up in Chrisman over on the west of here. And this is a photograph that her family took of a sand sucker off the shore at Ogden Dunes. Why the smoke? Well, it's a steam engine, basically. It's a steam engine on a boat that sucks the sand up from the bottom, and then when it's full, when it's full, you have to be real careful, because it's heavy. And then you very slowly, very carefully, hopefully in good weather, go to wherever your customer is, and then they'll take the sand out of your boat, and then you go back and get some more. The most famous sand sucker is one that didn't make it, and that's the J.D. Marshall. The J.D. Marshall still sits just north of Indiana Dunes State Park, where it sank in a storm, I think in the year 1911, if I'm right. Is that right, Serena?
I think so.
Waverly Beach was the name of the beach before there was a state park. And there was no state park in 1911, and so it was north of Waverly Beach that in a storm, the J.D. Marshall sank. And it would have been one of the best shipwrecks for you to go look at. I mean, all you have to do is take your scuba lessons and go looking at it, except some thieves got there first, picked up the boat, they're wanting to salvage it, all the equipment and stuff that was on board, and dropped it. And so then the boat fell down to the bottom and smashed and broke apart. And today, there are pieces of it that you can see at the state park. And the propeller used to be, I don't know if it's still over by the pavilion at the state park or not. That's the area that they want to put, new construction. And so I don't know if they've moved the propeller.
I think they definitely.
Do you think so? It makes sense that they would. So now,
We used to play on it when I was a kid.
really,
Oh, yeah.
sliding down the
Yeah.
blades. Never thought of it. Wow. And now here the geologist in me gets all excited again, because sand mining was a slow business. As soon as the trains were there, they could start hauling a lot of that sand away, and they found places that wanted to buy it. But in 1867, this part of Indiana found that it was over a huge natural gas field. When I say huge, I mean it was the biggest on Earth in Indiana. And there was so much there that people began to treat it the way we treat water or air. It's there, you can have it. And if you own property and you dig a well down and you get natural gas, you can have all that natural gas you want. Even though as you suck the natural gas out of the ground, gas is going to come from underneath other people's houses to your well and then up. But that's what happens with every water well anyway. You take water out of the ground through a well, And it's not just water from underneath your lot. Water may come through the aquifer from other places to your well, but that's all quite legal. But for 20 years, there was nobody who recognized the value of that natural gas. Then people began to. And the cities of Kokomo, Anderson, Gas City. Do you think that was its original name? No. Elwood, Indiana, Muncie, Indiana, all decided we can make some money on this. And they began offering free land to any industry that would come in and hire at least 50 men to work. And so central eastern Indiana, which we think of being mainly rural and farmland, has a number of rather small, good-sized, large, small towns that have very industrial bases. And you can see 162 factories were established over the Trenton gas field. 10,000 jobs were created by that gas field. But it was free. So if you hooked up your house to gas lighting, you didn't have to turn the gas off. It's like, it would be like electricity were free. And you could have all the lights and all the heat and whatever you want forever because it's free. And so that's the way people treated the gas. And houses had gas lighting, and you put a gas light in front of your house. And industries started using gas, and people that needed fuel, free fuel. I mean, how do you turn it down? And one of the kinds of companies that needs it the most is companies that require you to melt lead or to melt sand to turn it into glass. And so glass companies started being founded in here. And you could make a lot of money on this. In fact, one family made so much money, they endowed a university.
Ball State.
And you may be familiar with Ball State, named after the Ball brothers. And some of you recognize what I have in front of me. This glass was made from sand that was melted in Muncie. So it had to be taken to Muncie, to the factory, melted, and turned into a jar. But it's a blue jar. Why is it blue? Because the sand had some impurity in it. It's impurities in sand, or melted sand, that give glass its color. Cobalt is a metal, but a fine amount of cobalt in glass will make it a beautiful dark blue glass. And gold will make it red. And some strange impurity, the Ball Company never figured out what it was according to its website. I don't believe that for a minute. They don't want you to know what it was, or their competitors. But it says Ball, perfect mason glass. Why is it? Well, because it was blue. There was an impurity in the glass up in Michigan City. The Hoosier Slide, which was said to be the tallest sand dune on the Lake Michigan shore. This was, however, before they were accurately measuring them. And whether it was really taller than Mount Tom, I don't know. But the books were all written before they could measure precise heights. And they say it was the tallest, so we go with that. But the Hoosier Slide sand had some impurity that made the glass blue. Well, so all the glass companies were ignoring Michigan City sand until Ball figured out that foods stored in colored glass last longer than foods stored in clear glass. Then there was a market for Michigan City sand. And whereas sand mining started in the 1850s and 60s and 70s in Lake County and in Porter County, by the 1990s, after 1887, did I say 1990?
Yeah.
1890s, specifically after 1887, mining sand became very, very valuable. We have new customers and they wanted a lot of sand. An estimated 90% of the gas was lost through venting, simply venting it out by widespread misuse. You know, you have this gas coming out. If it has a leak, there's no economic incentive to stop the leak. And people just use gas as, you know, like it was going to last forever. But it didn't. By 1902, the well pressure began to drop. By 1920, Indiana was importing natural gas. All of the glass companies went broke eventually, except for one. The Kokomo Art Glass Company in Kokomo, Indiana, is still open. They give tours. It's a fabulous place to visit. It's hot inside because they melt the glass and they make beautiful things out of glass they make quite locally. However, although Kokomo was over the Trenton gas field, they now buy their gas from NIPSCO. They really do. So where did all this gas come from? Well, when I was asked to do this report, I have to say the evidence is kind of hard to find because all the companies that mined the sand, that mined sand, were private companies. Their financial records were in the company's safe and probably thrown away when the company went broke. You know, who's going to save that kind of stuff? So it's really hard to tell how much sand was ever taken from any particular place. But land records, you know, ask Serena if you want a map showing who owned what property in Porter County in various years, such as 1895. And if you look at her 1895 map, you'll see the Chicago Mutual Sand and Gravel Company that is here. Charles B. Shedd should be, with two D's, should be a familiar name to all of you. C.D. Shedd, same Shedd. And over here is the, I can't read it. I need to start putting in better quality slides. And one of the biggest misnomers in Porter County is an area called Dune Park.
Yeah.
Dune Park, this is a picture of Dune Park. It was a sand mining operation, basically. There were some people who lived there. It was subdivided into lots. But, you know, it was, if you look at an old map, it may look like it was a town. Because on a map, it'll look very much like Chesterton or Chrisman or Miller or Porter. But if you draw lines on a map, that doesn't necessarily affect what the ground looks like. And Dune Park was an industrial sand mining area. And it was one of the largest sand mining areas of the country. It's about where where the Port of Indiana is today. It was not a park. However, the South Shore named its newest station Dune Park, which is not at the old Dune Park. It's on near Route 49. It's closer to Porter and Chesterton than it is to what was then Dune Park. But notice the sentence down at the bottom. It was said to be the best grossing freight station on the entire Michigan Southern Railroad between Elkhart and Chicago. They made more money at this station because they handled sand. Now this is a Lake County map. This is the town of Etna. And the Castle Sand Company and the Garden City Sand Company. And E.A. Shedd, again, owned land in Etna. And The Etna Powder Company, those of you who are a little more familiar with Lake County history know that Etna had one of the largest gunpowder operations in the Midwest. And the Miller Cemetery has a number of unmarked graves of men who died in explosions there. Why did they build there? Well, it's said that the sand dunes, were sort of protection. If there was an explosion, at least people on the other side of the sand dune wouldn't get hit. And here we are in Miller, which is a little bit north of Etna. The American Sand and Gravel Company, Garden City again, American Sand, Knickerbocker Ice Company. Knickerbocker was big into, what does that say? Ice Company. I'm here to talk about sand. Why would I have a colored map and show ice the same as Garden City's Sand Company and Knickerbocker Ice Company? Because most of those companies did both. In the summertime, you mine sand because there's no ice. In the wintertime, you can't mine sand because the ground is frozen, and so is the lake, any lake nearby. And so you have these men, most of them were males, and they need work. They have families they have to support. So in the wintertime, the same guys, same companies mine winter ice, and in the summer they would do sand. So anytime you see a sand company or an ice company, they're in business doing both. And this is the picture we started with, the American Sand and Gravel Company in south part of Miller. I got this picture from the Calumet Regional Archives at IU Northwest. I will say that to any young people who want to have a job like mine, if you want to be successful, you want to marry a research librarian, like I did. But these are all open gondola cars, all filled with sand. And all the engineer has to do is move the train about 20 feet so that there was an empty car next to the dune, and then they'll fill that one. Then you move the train another 20 feet and then fill the next car. Then you move the train another 20 feet and then fill the next car. And they did this day after day after day.
Were they filled with one scoop or?
No. Many scoops. Well, it depends on the size of the scoop, the clamshell, and the size of the car. But I assume it was at least 2 or 3. Knickerbocker Ice Company, besides the sand, mine ice, and they built huge buildings along the shore of various buildings because nobody's going to buy ice in the wintertime. Or back in pioneer days, you made your own. But in the summertime, ice was very valuable. So you needed the winter ice to last until summer so you could sell it. And so they would build these large double insulated buildings and fill them with sand. Usually they dug holes in the ground. At least that's what my grandfather did. They had a farm. My grandfather grew up on a farm on Ridge Road south of Gary, and the barn had a deep hole dug in it. And Grandpa and his brothers would go down to the Little Calumet River when it was frozen, and they would cut ice and put it on their wagon and haul it up and throw it down down to this deep hole and cover it with sawdust. Sawdust is a great insulator. The Knickerbocker Ice Company had 2 wooden walls, I'm guessing about 6 inches, 12 inches apart, that they filled with sawdust. Can you imagine if there were a fire? And here's harvesting on Long Lake that stretches from Portage into Miller. And I have another photo of ice cutting on Wolf Lake. And it surprised me when I looked at this picture the first time, because the first thing the guys had to do was shovel the snow off the ice so they could get to the hard ice and then cut that. Now you notice in this first picture, they're using hand saws. Later on, it was a little more mechanized, but you couldn't take very many heavy machines like those steam shovels out onto the ice. So this was a manual job for a long, long time. Although eventually they ended up with steam-powered conveyor belts to move the sand from the lake up to the upper levels of the ice houses. And here's same people harvesting sand near Long Lake. Here's the sand dune on the right and the steam shovel. So you turn to the right, you pick up the sand, you turn the sand around, the machine around and dump it into the waiting railroad car. Interesting thing happened in the Chrisman area, which is south of the dunes. That's in the Calumet shoreline. It's older sand. It's not the Tolleson dune sand. And it was farmland. And here were a couple of companies that bought bought land in order to do some mining. But this is where the Nicholson farm was. This is Chrisman, this is where the tracks crossed. And their farms were here. And a fellow from U.S. Steel, 1908, I think it was. No, it had been later than that, 1909, 1910, came to them and said, Mr. Nicholson, you have some unused property. It's too hilly to farm very well, but it's exactly the kind of sand that we need in the steel mills. It's not dune sand. Dune sand has been rubbed by friction with other grains of sand, either under the water or by the waves or the wind, and it tends to be rounded grains. The Chrisman sand was sharper than that, and it was perfect for the steel making industry. And so Nicholson said, well, this land is useless to us, can't farm it, so they started selling some of their sand to U.S. Steel, and then Inland Steel got involved on it. All the steel companies basically came out this way. And the area north of the tracks, and north of Route 20, which Route 20 that was built in through here, was built. You know this area as the Ameriplex area in Portage, where Quaker Steak and Lube, or something like that is. And that whole, the area is rather flat, right? It wasn't before. It is now, but thanks to the Chrisman Sand Company, it's flat now and employs an awful lot of people. So Ameriplex is over there. The Shirley Hines Preserve, the Coulter Preserve is right over here, and it's immediately south of the National Lakeshore. And this area was heavily mined using the B&O railroad tracks. And I have a picture of the John Boss Sand Company. This is where the Coulter Nature Preserve is today. It's a very strange nature preserve because it was extremely disturbed by sand mining operation, but it hasn't been mined in the last 50 years, and it's been allowed to return to its natural habitat. This is the Chrisman family in 1925. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Chrisman Sand Company. That's the words Chrisman Sand on its steam shovel. They had a number of, if the railroad wasn't close enough, you could use trucks, put the sand in trucks and haul it off. And now we have Michigan City. West of Michigan City was a great deal of land that was owned by Chauncey Blair, who was very interested in making as much money as he could. But the most famous part of sand mining in Michigan City was up at the mouth of Trail Creek. Mount Baldy is right over here. Why is it bald? Because of sand mining. The dunes tend to be wooded all the way up to the top. Mount Baldy isn't. Why? Because that area was mined. But they stopped the mining, and the dune was, the trees were removed, So the wind comes up and starts blowing that sand, and the dune starts to migrate. And it's moving south. And if you've been, you now can go back, that area is open back up again. Just being in the parking lot, you don't even have to get out of the car to be absolutely amazed at the size of that dune and realizing it is marching south as the wind blows the sand from the north up over the top and back and falls down the south side. It is now very close to the parking lot.
Sure is.
In fact, I haven't been in there since last fall. I don't know if it's gotten to the parking lot or not, but it's going to bury its own parking lot. And it is such, if you go on a sunny day and the sun's in the south and you see the south face, it's a marvelous, awe-inspiring sight looking at Mount Baldy. It is not awe-inspiring looking at the Hoosier Slide, which was, oh, by the way, Mount Baldy, newspaper writers left and right call it the tallest sand dune in the national park. It is not. It's not. In fact, if it were, you would say, why are people all excited about the dunes? The tallest dunes are in the state park, which is part of the national park system. It's within the boundaries of the national park. Mount Tom, Mount Green, Mount Holden, thank you. But the Hoosier Slide was said to be taller than those. And we have some pictures of the Hoosier Slide. Here's Trail Creek going in, all warehouses in the up near the beach. And this is the Hoosier Slide, covered with trees. Why is it called the Hoosier Slide? Well, we're not really sure. One is because it was so much fun to slide down. The other is because of the avalanches, where it got to be so steep that the sand just came down like mud slides someplace, away from here. But here, somebody wrote on this postcard, sliding down the Hoosier Slide, Michigan City, Indiana. People like to get married at the top. Imagine wearing a wedding dress, walking all the way to the top of that sand dune, and all your guests coming up as well, wearing the clothing that they wore back in the 1890s and the 1880s. Here's the Hoosier Slide, colored postcard. Very few trees on top. And now, if I took a picture of the Hoosier Slide, what you would see is the NIPSCO power station and the cooling tower. Because they lowered it all the way down to the bottom. This was the first aid station right at the base of the sand dune. And notice the guy, the photographer, I don't think was interested in this, but I am. Here is the guy with his wheelbarrow. This mountain of sand and this wheelbarrow. People advertised. There were so many people that wanted to buy sand. These are two different advertisements. One for the S.J. Taylor Sand Company, and this one doesn't identify it, but it's the Hoosier Slide Sand Company. Clean Drift, Lake Michigan Core Sand. Why did people take sand? Well, you didn't really want the sand. You wanted the sand gone so that you could build a ditch, like I'm always going to pronounce it wrong. Kitzel ditch, is that how you say it? And that whole area was mined. And it's very seldom you can find a before and an after picture. But the Historical Society of Ogden Dunes had a 1956 picture of Locust Drive with a sand dune at the end of the drive. That sand dune is no longer there, so I went in 2015 and took this picture of what Locust Drive looks like today. So even during the time when it was subdivided and people were celebrating living in the dunes, they were still mining sand and taking sand out of there. And I'm almost done. I see Serena standing, which sounds like she's about to pounce. Turn off the electricity. So sand mining had to be mined in order to get it out of the way to build Route 12, the Dunes Highway. This is a fabulous picture of a machine, a steam engine, steam shovel at Indiana Dunes State Park. And I talked to the naturalists there, and they have no idea when or why a picture like this would have been taken. So if Arthur Anderson, who took the picture, if his caption is correct, there was some sand mining there. Sand customers, Chicago was a big customer. Steel mills, Northwestern University, you know where they got their sand. Some of you do, I'll have a picture cut out. Jackson Park for the World's Fair in 1893 was built on Indiana sand. It was taken from Indiana to South Chicago to make space to make the ground high enough to have a World's Fair. Northerly Island, which had Biggs Field on it for a while, was not only taken from Indiana sand, it was taken from the beach. I mean, it was a sand sucker operation because the state of Indiana figured out they could make money charging people, letting them suck the sand off the bottom of Lake Michigan. Not realizing that if you do it half a mile offshore, the sand's going to wash from the shore to fill that hole and cause shore erosion at the beach. So Northerly Island now looks like this, but if you want to see the Indiana sand dunes when you're in Chicago, there it is. The salamanders, when they drain the furnaces at Inland Steel and U.S. Steel, this sand comes from the Chrisman area. These blue ball jars and insulators. When you see the blue ball jar, you know it was Hoosier slide sand. When the sand dune was running out, Ball Company bought 10 years worth of supply ahead of time and stockpiled it in Muncie. So that when the dune was gone, they still could go making ball jars for another 10 years. Now they put artificial colors in. They can just look the same. And Chrisman Sand Company is still in business. They moved their operation from the Portage area in Ogden Dunes, from Portage down to Valparaiso. They now have sand mining south of US 6, but they're not in the dune area anymore. And I'm going to scoot ahead just a little bit because it's some 1952 maps. Beverly Shores and Westchester Township escaped most of the sand mining for many, many years until Bethlehem Steel came in. And then it became one of the largest sand mining operations ever along the lake. And I want to close with this map. This is a 1953 topographic map of Northwestern University up at Evanston. And this is the shoreline. And now here's a later map. You see the difference between those two? That's 53, that's 1993, that's Westchester Township sand. Northwestern got in a lot of trouble. The president actually had to publish an article saying, we didn't know where the sand was coming from. We just signed a contract with a company that said they would provide it. So, and then if you've been to the Portage Park, the new river walk and all, and I won't talk about the sand that's missing. This is the picture from 1940 map, and this with the acid settling ponds is what it looked like in 1991. So there's no sand mining going up there to speak of anymore, and very little in the last 50 years because once the national park was established, people who needed sand then moved elsewhere.
We call that the Burns Ditch. They call that the Burns Ditch.
Yeah. What else?
That's all I. That was the name. The Burns.
It's named after Randall Burns,
Yes.
who didn't build it. He didn't own the land, but it was his idea.